I grew up understanding that our family wasn't like others. It wasn't just about weekend barbecues or holidays spent crowding around a table piled high with food. For us, family meant legacy. It meant that when my grandfather founded a law firm, he wasn't just setting up a business, he was building an institution. Something meant to last. Something to hold us all together even after he was gone. From the day I started law school, I felt the weight of that legacy. It wasn't an oppressive weight. Though, in fact, it was something that spurred me forward. Every late night studying and every internship, I reminded myself that I was working towards something bigger than myself. Eventually, that weight took the shape of responsibility and pride. This firm was the backbone of our family. It provided us with a reputation in the community, respect, stability, and, ultimately, a future. I couldn't wait to become a part of it. To take up the torch that my father and grandfather had carried before me. My cousin, on the other hand, seemed to have a more complicated relationship with the family business. He had joined the firm around the same time I had, though his path hadn't been as direct. He'd wandered through different interests and jobs before finally settling at the firm, where he took on a general administrative role. It was a good job for him. A way to stay connected without the same level of ambition or drive that I had. I never resented him for it. I knew he had his strengths. And I respected him for finding his own way. Yet, as my father's retirement drew nearer, and it became clear that I would take the lead, I began to sense something simmering beneath the surface. At first, I brushed it off. Family was family. And we'd grown up together like brothers. We'd shared summers at the lake, endured long family meetings, and laughed about our grandfather's relentless work ethic. I never considered that he might feel left out or overlooked, as though the firm's future belonged more to me than to him. When the transition process formally began, I felt nothing but pride. 4 months. My father and I worked closely, preparing for the moment he'd officially step down, and I'd take the reins. The workload was intense, but every late night felt worth it. Especially as I started to map out my own vision for the firm. I imagined incorporating new technologies, improving our client engagement, and expanding our outreach programs. Each detail I considered felt like another brick laid on the solid foundation my family had spent generations building. But as the weeks went on, I noticed subtle signs that not everyone was as enthusiastic as I was. My cousin's work grew a bit more erratic. Files were misplaced. Deadlines were missed. And I began finding minor but perplexing errors in records he'd managed. I brushed them off as simple mistakes at first. After all, we were both under a lot of pressure. But as the incidents began to mount, a gnawing feeling of unease settled over me. I told myself I was just being paranoid. That family wouldn't betray family. And that I'd built a solid enough bond with him to avoid suspicion. The day I discovered the files were missing started like any other. I had come in early, armed with coffee and a list of final tasks to check off before the big day. I had plans to meet with our biggest clients, update them on our smooth transition, and assure them that I was ready to continue delivering the quality of work they expected from our firm. I felt prepared. More than that, I felt confident. Like all the hours of preparation were about to pay off. But when I sat down at my desk and pulled up the digital files, an empty screen stared back at me. My first reaction was confusion. Maybe I had selected the wrong folder or mistyped the file name. I searched again, this time with more urgency. As the minutes ticked by, my heart began to pound louder and faster. Every single critical file, the client records, case documents, billing histories, was gone. The digital logs were blank, as if the records had simply vanished into thin air. My hands shook as I scanned the system, hoping against hope that this was just a technical glitch. I called IT, barely managing to keep my voice steady. Within minutes, they were on it, tapping away at keyboards, combing through our network, and muttering technical jargon to each other. I could feel a pit forming in my stomach as I watched them work. It wasn't just a glitch, this was something deliberate. Someone had gone in and erased years of work, undoing the very fabric of our firm's foundation. When they finally looked up at me, their expressions were grim. "It wasn't an accident," one of them said. The words hit me like a punch. Someone had actively deleted our records. And whoever had done it had done a thorough job, making sure that recovery would be next to impossible. The loss wasn't just financial or administrative, it was personal. And I could feel the betrayal prickling at the edges of my disbelief. The thought crossed my mind, was it possible that my cousin could have done this? I recoiled at the idea, shaking my head as if that would clear it. But I couldn't ignore the growing list of small mistakes he'd been making, or the simmering resentment I'd brushed aside so often. It felt unthinkable, almost absurd, to suspect him. Yet here I was, holding the shattered remnants of our firm in my hands, and realizing I didn't know who I could trust. The next few days blurred together in a haze of meetings, apologies, and frantic efforts to manage the damage. Every moment felt like a countdown, as if I were racing against time to stop the bleeding. Client after client called, asking for explanations, venting frustrations, and expressing doubts about their future with us. I understood their reactions. How could they trust a firm that couldn't even safeguard its own records? But beyond the exhaustion and frustration, a deeper feeling gnawed at me, a feeling of failure. I had prided myself on being prepared, on being the right person to carry on my family's legacy. And now, here I was, barely hanging on, with our reputation slipping through my fingers. The financial toll hit quickly, and it was brutal. Several key clients pulled out almost immediately, unwilling to risk further disruptions. Others asked for assurances that I could barely give, promises I was afraid to make. As the client base began to thin, I felt the tangible weight of what had been taken from me. From all of us. This wasn't just data, this was our family's trust, our security, and our future. And then, late one night, as I sat in the quiet, dimly lit office trying to make sense of it all, I found myself coming back to one question over and over: why? What could have pushed someone to destroy everything we had worked so hard to build? I thought of my cousin, of all the signs I had ignored, and felt a twinge of guilt and anger mingling within me. This wasn't just a betrayal of the firm, it was a betrayal of our family, our shared history, and everything we'd built together. In that moment, I realized I was standing at a crossroads. I could let the anger consume me, let it tear apart the remnants of what little I had left. Or I could dig deep, pull from the strength my family had instilled in me, and find a way to rise from this wreckage. The days that followed felt like a slow-motion car crash. Every morning, I arrived at the office, hoping some miracle would have fixed things overnight. But each time I checked, I was met with the same void where all of our case files and client records once lived. I threw myself into recovery attempts, barely sleeping or eating. I met with IT experts, legal consultants, and data specialists, all while juggling the task of keeping our clients reassured. My father, who had hoped for a peaceful retirement, stepped back in to help, his concern mixing with disappointment. I hated that look in his eyes, that subtle message that maybe I wasn't quite ready after all. I worked around the clock, grasping for even the smallest lead. We hired a team of forensic specialists to comb through the remains of our network, painstakingly piecing together fragments of data. They warned me the process would be slow, and even then, recovery would likely be incomplete. But I held on to that shred of hope, too drained to consider any other option. During this time, I felt the strain on my family bonds pulling me in all directions. My father, despite his disappointment, stood by me. My mother tried to offer comfort, though she clearly didn't understand the full extent of the damage. The hardest part was facing my cousin. Every time I saw him at the office, his presence was a reminder of what we'd lost and of the gnawing suspicion that he was responsible. In private, I couldn't help but let the bitterness fester. If he was responsible, he'd brought ruin upon everything I cared about. And for what? To prove a point? To take some twisted revenge? But on the surface, I forced myself to stay civil, to give him the benefit of the doubt. Even as it became harder each day, the pressure began to take a toll. I felt trapped under the weight of expectations, my father's, my grandfather's, and even my own. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd somehow failed them all. Sleep became a luxury I could barely afford. And when I did close my eyes, my mind replayed the same thoughts in relentless loops. What had I missed? How had I let this happen? Had I been too focused on the future to notice the cracks forming in the present? A few friends noticed the changes in me and offered support. But I found myself shutting them out, unable to share the full extent of what I was dealing with. How could they understand the legacy? The pride? The betrayal? This solitude gave way to long nights in the office, where the quiet only amplified my doubts. I began to feel a creeping paranoia. Every step, every decision I'd made in my journey to take over the firm felt questionable. Had I overlooked something critical? Maybe I was too young, too eager, too blind to the challenges of leadership. 2 weeks into the ordeal, our forensic team made a breakthrough. They managed to recover a small portion of our lost files, a handful of client records, some billing details, and a scattering of case documents. It was far from a full recovery, but it was something. That small triumph reignited a spark in me. With these fragments, I went back to our clients, painstakingly reaching out one by one. I explained the situation as honestly as I could, laying out the steps we'd taken and our commitment to safeguarding their information. Some clients appreciated the transparency, while others were understandably skeptical. I offered reassurances where I could, and though some decided to stay, others chose to part ways. Each loss stung, but I knew we couldn't force anyone to trust us again. I focused on the clients who stayed, doing everything in my power to re-establish that trust. My father's presence in these meetings was invaluable. His experience and calm steadiness tempered my own frazzled nerves, allowing me to face our clients with a sense of confidence, however tenuous. In the midst of this ongoing recovery, something strange happened. While organizing one of our recovered files, I noticed a series of unusual edits in the document logs. The timestamps and access records pointed back to a specific user ID, my cousin's. It hit me like a physical blow. The evidence wasn't definitive, but it was enough to stir an undeniable suspicion. All those little signs I'd brushed off, every missed deadline and misplaced file, it had all led here. I'd tried so hard to avoid accusing him, to believe that family was incapable of such sabotage. But now, with the facts laid out in front of me, I couldn't escape the truth. In that moment, a surge of anger bubbled up inside me, mixed with disbelief and heartbreak. This was the person I'd grown up with, someone I'd trusted, someone who was supposed to be on my side. I was filled with 1,000 questions, each sharper than the last. Why would he do this? What could possibly drive him to take such destructive action against our own family? As the days wore on, I found myself revisiting memories of my cousin, trying to piece together his motives. Was he jealous? Did he feel sidelined? I'd always known he was less passionate about the firm, more content to drift along rather than dedicate himself fully. But maybe I had underestimated his feelings, his own aspirations and insecurities. In some ways, it felt like an indictment of our family dynamics. We had always prized loyalty and ambition. But had we, in our own way, created an environment that stifled those who didn't fit that mold? Had we set him up to feel like an outsider, someone peripheral to the main event of the family business? The realization was painful, but in a way, it brought a sense of clarity. I couldn't change the past, but I could understand it. And maybe, just maybe, I could find a way to move forward without letting bitterness consume me. Still, the path to forgiveness felt long and treacherous, and I wasn't sure if I was strong enough to make it to the other side. Armed with this new understanding, I set to work rebuilding what I could. I hired a new team, brought in consultants to shore up our security systems, and instituted new checks to prevent anything like this from happening again. It was exhausting, but I poured everything I had into the effort, determined to prove to myself, to my family, and to our clients that we could survive this. Piece by piece, the firm began to regain stability. We were a smaller operation now, having lost several clients along the way. But the clients who stayed seemed more loyal than ever. They understood the dedication it took to rebuild from such a loss, and they saw the transparency with which we handled every step of the process. My father eventually stepped back again, this time with a renewed sense of confidence in me. It felt like a second chance, a chance to prove that I could live up to the legacy that my family had entrusted to me. With the firm on more stable ground, I felt ready to confront my cousin. This wasn't an easy decision. Part of me wanted to let him fade out of my life completely. But I couldn't ignore the need for closure, for some semblance of understanding. So, I reached out, asking him to meet. When we finally sat down, I spoke about the impact of his actions. The devastation he had caused not just to me, but to the whole family. I didn't accuse him outright. Instead, I asked him why. For the first time, he seemed vulnerable, expressing a mix of jealousy, resentment, and, surprisingly, regret. He admitted to feeling overshadowed, as though his role in the family had always been secondary, a placeholder beside the main attraction of our family's legacy. It was a difficult conversation, filled with raw honesty and uncomfortable truths. But in the end, I found myself able to forgive, not fully. Not yet. But enough to move forward without the weight of resentment hanging over me. Looking back on the experience, I came to understand that this was a turning point, both for me and for the firm. I had learned the hard way about the importance of vigilance, of balancing trust with accountability. I had discovered that family bonds, while powerful, couldn't replace the need for clear boundaries and professional safeguards. More than that, I had learned about resilience. Our firm had been put through a test, and though we emerged smaller, we were stronger. I felt a renewed commitment to honoring the legacy my grandfather had built. Not by clinging to the past, but by embracing change and learning from mistakes. Months after the chaos had subsided, I stood in the office one evening, looking out over the city. The lights of the buildings twinkled in the dark, each one representing a life, a story, a client we had helped over the years. I felt a deep sense of pride, not just in the firm, but in the journey I had taken to get here. This wasn't the path I had envisioned, but in a way, it was the one I needed. I had been forced to confront my own weaknesses, my assumptions, and my biases. And in the process, I had grown not just as a lawyer or a business owner, but as a person. I knew there would be more challenges ahead, but I felt ready for them. This was my family's legacy. And now, it was mine to protect, nurture, and grow. Whatever came next, I was ready to face it with the strength I had found within myself, forged in the fires of betrayal, resilience, and, ultimately, forgiveness.